All right, let's dive right in. We are talking about a man who you could argue is one of the most influential figures in all of Western history, the Apostle Paul. His story, his writings, they are an absolute cornerstone of the Christian faith. I mean, for almost 2,000 years, he's been seen as the main event. Paul is our primary historical witness to the very birth of Christianity. His letters? Well, they're believed to be the oldest Christian texts we have, and they have shaped everything from theology to global culture. And that is the giant, provocative question we are digging into today. There's a pretty radical theory out there that says the Paul we all think we know, the guy who wrote all those famous letters, is actually a complete fabrication. Okay, so before we jump into that rabbit hole, let's just ground ourselves for a second. What does the vast majority of scholarship, the mainstream view, say about Paul? The standard story is pretty straightforward. Paul was a real dude, a historical figure who lived in the first century. And sometime around the 50s and 60s CE, he wrote at least 7 of the letters that have his name on them. And this is a huge deal, because it means we have a direct window into the Christian faith just 20 years or so after Jesus. Right. Now let's meet the person who basically wants to light that entire consensus on fire and throw it out the window. His name is Hermann Detering, a German theologian. Detering comes from this school of thought called radical criticism. Now you can think of it as historical investigation where the default setting is just switched to doubt. It doesn't just poke holes in the details, it questions the entire foundation. The whole point is to get to the absolute roots of Christian origins totally free from any church tradition or dogma. And this really lays out the core battle right here. You see, mainstream scholars, they might argue about whether Paul wrote 7 of the letters, or maybe 10 or 13. Detering's answer? Nope. 0. He argues that every single one of them, even the undisputed heavy hitters like Romans and Corinthians, are all clever forgeries from the 2nd century. Okay, a claim that big, that Paul is a total fake, needs some serious evidence, right? You can't just throw that out there. So how does Detering build this case? Well, he really relies on 3 main lines of argument. His case is built on what's missing from the history books, what's actually inside the letters themselves, and the very way they seem to have been put together. So this is the first major red flag for Detering. Think about it. If these letters were so foundational, written by an actual apostle in the 50s, you would think that the early church fathers, writing in the decades after, would be quoting them all the time. But they don't. There's just silence. And this timeline just makes the problem so clear. Paul supposedly writes around 50 CE, but the very first time we hear about a collection of his letters isn't until almost 100 years later with this controversial figure named Marcion. Even a major theologian like Justin Martyr, who was writing tons of stuff around 150 CE, never mentions Paul, not once. For Detering, that century of silence is just deafening. The next part of the argument looks at the actual content. Detering says that the ideas, the theological fights happening in Paul's letters, they just don't feel right for the mid-1st century. In fact, they look a whole lot like the really intense arguments that were going on in the 2nd century. You see these sharp divides right here? This intense focus on law versus the gospel, or the flesh versus the spirit? These ideas seem a bit out of place for the early days. But you know where they fit perfectly? The 2nd century, when you had groups like the Gnostics and the followers of Marcion who were completely obsessed with these exact kinds of cosmic duality. And the third piece of evidence is all about how the letters are written. Detering, following some earlier thinkers, argues that these are not smooth, cohesive documents from a single author. He says they're more like patchwork quilts, stitched together from different smaller texts, leaving all these awkward seams and contradictions that hint at multiple editors working over a long time. So let's follow this logic. If the letters are fakes and they were written 100 years later, then a massive question just pops up. Where did the story of Paul even come from? And this is where Detering's theory gets really wild. By arguing that the letters are forgeries and that the book of Acts is more like historical fiction than fact, Detering basically creates a vacuum. The historical apostle Paul, the person we thought we knew, just kind of evaporates, poofs. So where did the legend come from? Detering puts forward a pretty shocking candidate for the real Paul, a guy named Simon Magus, or Simon the Magician. Now, in mainstream Christian tradition, this guy was the ultimate bad guy, like the number one heretic, the person they blamed for starting all heresy. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Detering looks at texts outside the Bible, like one called the Pseudo-Clementines, where Simon Magus is the arch nemesis of the Apostle Peter. And the funny thing is, this so-called heretic, Simon, sounds an awful lot like the Apostle Paul. I mean, both of them claim their authority comes directly from God through visions, not from the original apostles in Jerusalem. And both of them are shown having a massive public showdown with Peter. The parallels are pretty striking. He even points to what could be a tiny linguistic clue. In some old texts, a nickname for Simon is the Greek word atomos, which means indivisible. Detering suggests this could be a kind of pun on the Latin name Paulus, which means small or least. And that, of course, connects right back to Paul calling himself the least of the apostles. The idea here is that Paul was just a code name for the heretic Simon. So, what does mainstream scholarship think about all this? Well, as you can probably guess, the pushback is pretty intense. While Detering's research is no doubt thorough, it has definitely not won over the academic world at large. Critics really push back hard. They say, look, while Detering points out some real puzzles in the text, he ignores the much simpler explanation that Paul was a real guy, and these little oddities have perfectly normal explanations. They argue he dismisses crucial sources like the Book of Acts way too easily, and that his whole theory ends up creating way more historical problems than it actually solves. So, after all the back and forth, the arguments and the counter-arguments, where does all of this leave Hermann Detering's really wild thesis?
Look, Detering's theory is still way out on the academic fringe. The consensus rejects it. But it hasn't just disappeared. It's actually become a kind of foundational text for modern radical critics, for anyone who wants to question the traditional story of Christian origins. It acts as this comprehensive scholarly blueprint for the most extreme skeptical position you can take.
In the end, this whole case of the fabricated Paul, even though it's a fringe theory, it forces a really powerful question on all of us. It's a fantastic reminder that history isn't just a list of facts. It's an active interpretation of piecing things together from scraps and fragments. And it really pushes us to ask, on what evidence do our most foundational stories truly rest?